This single mom couldn't afford rent, so her landlord offered her a deal, but not in cash. What she did next will leave you speechless. A friend of a friend told me this wild story, so stay tuned to find out what people are doing to survive in this economy. She lived in the same small house for 7 years. It wasn't much, just two bedrooms, a sagging porch, and walls that creaked in the winter. But it was in a good neighborhood, safe, quiet, close to a school where her son had just started kindergarten. It was, by every measure that mattered, home. She was 26 now, with a 5-year-old boy who knew nothing of the world's weight. His father had disappeared before the first ultrasound. There were no calls, no birthday cards, no support, just silence. So she carried everything alone: the bills, the daycare, pickups, the late night worries about groceries and rent. She worked retail. The hours were inconsistent, the pay barely above minimum wage, but it let her be there when it mattered most. She could walk her son to school, she could tuck him in at night, and that mattered more than anything. But life didn't care about sentiment. Rent had climbed steadily, year after year. What started as a manageable payment had nearly doubled. $1,200 increase over 7 years, all in the name of market value. Her wages, meanwhile, had barely moved. She tried to keep up. She clipped coupons, skipped meals, let the power bill slide a few days late just to cover the gas. There were weeks she chose between groceries and rent, weeks she went without so her son never had to. Eventually, she started falling behind. Not by much at first. $150 short one month, $200 short the next. She paid what she could and hoped something shifted, but nothing ever did. The debt snowballed. By the time the landlord came for his annual inspection, she showed over $2,000 in back rent, and still he announced another increase was coming. She didn't cry, she didn't argue, she simply nodded, numb. Her son had just started school here. He had made a friend. He loved his teacher. Uprooting him now would be another trauma she couldn't bear to add to the list. And then her landlord offered something else. He sat at the kitchen table, casually, said there might be another arrangement if she was open to it. He never used crude words. He didn't have to. She understood exactly what he meant. She walked him to the door, said nothing, and closed it quietly behind him. And then she sat on the couch, holding herself together, while the silence filled the room like fog. That night she stared at the ceiling while her son slept. Her mind scanned every possibility: shelter, moving in with a coworker, working in overnights, shifts, selling her car. None of it added up. She had no margin for error, no family to call, no fallback plan, just one unbearable offer, and a decision to make. She didn't agree to the arrangement right away. When her landlord first made the suggestion, vague but unmistakable, something inside her froze. The words weren't crude, the tone wasn't aggressive, but the implication hung in the air like a fog she couldn't breathe through. He had offered her an option, and she knew deep down that it really wasn't an option at all. That night after he left, she sat in silence. Her son was asleep in the next room, his small body curled under a blanket with cartoon dinosaurs. She stared at the ceiling as questions and calculations raced through her mind. Rent was past due by over 2,000. Another increase was coming. Her hours at work weren't enough. Every credit card was maxed. Every friend she could borrow from had already said no. She had nowhere to go, no one to call, and a 5-year-old who just started school in a neighborhood he felt safe in. She thought of shelters, waiting lists, sleeping in her car, uprooting her son again. And then she thought about the landlord's words. That other option. The next day, without ceremony or drama, she said yes. She told herself it would be just once, just to buy herself time, just to keep the roof overhead, just until she could find something, anything else. The first time it happened, she felt herself retreat inward, like her mind couldn't bear to be in the same room. She moved through it like she was watching someone else's body go through the motions. Afterward, she sat in the shower for an hour, letting the water run cold. She didn't cry loudly. She couldn't. Her son was in the next room. In the days that followed, she became quieter, not colder, but distant. She went to work, she packed lunches, she folded laundry. Life continued because it had to. And then came the relief. Rent was no longer overdue. There were no longer warning letters, no more awkward texts from her landlord, no threats of eviction. She hated herself for feeling the slightest bit of comfort, but it was real. The pressure that had wrapped around her chest for months had loosened. There was enough room to breathe again. Barely, but enough to function. The arrangement continued, a few nights a month. When her son was staying with a friend or her coworker who occasionally babysat, always at her place, always with the same quiet understanding. No affection, no questions, no expectations beyond what had been silently agreed to. But it wasn't transactional in the way money changed hands. It was, but not easily, but instinctively, like people do when survival is on the line. She started wearing makeup again, not because she wanted to, but because it made things easier. She smiled when she needed to, faked pleasure when she didn't feel anything at all. She became someone else in those moments, someone practical, detached, efficient. It wore on her. Sex had always been something deeply emotional for her, intimate, vulnerable. Now it was a task, a means to an end, a necessary compromise in a world that gave her no alternatives. There were nights when the weight of it all felt unbearable. She would lie in bed, staring into the dark, wondering if this would ever end, wondering if she would one day forget how it felt to give herself willingly. But she never let herself spiral too far. She always came back to her son. Every morning she woke up and poured cereal into a bowl. She packed his lunch, she brushed his hair, and zipped his jacket, and walked him to school. She smiled at him, and when he smiled back, it gave her just enough strength to keep going. To the outside world she looked fine, holding all together, strong even. No one saw the cracks, no one saw what it cost. She didn't tell friends. She didn't confess in group chats. Not because she thought she was wrong, but because she knew that the world wasn't built to understand people like her. The kind of people who did everything right and still ended up in impossible situations. She knew the world judged women like her. But what the world didn't know, couldn't possibly understand, was that she wasn't ashamed of surviving. She was just tired of pretending it was easy. By the 6 month mark, the arrangement had become routine. It was no longer awkward glances or unspoken tension, just scheduled visits, like appointments she didn't want but couldn't cancel. The landlord never pushed for more, and over time the novelty for him seemed to fade. What was once charged with discomfort and shame had flattened into something mechanical. For her, the emotional toll remained, but it no longer controlled her. She had compartmentalized the experience so deeply that some nights she could pretend it hadn't happened at all. It wasn't that the pain disappeared, she had just grown stronger than it. And in the quiet aftermath of every encounter, when she sat in the stillness of her living room, she reminded herself of why she was doing this. Her son, the little boy who lit up when he saw the Christmas tree she managed to buy this year. The one who jumped with joy at the wrapped toys under it. Real presents, not dollar store items like the years before. The boy who didn't have to know what she sacrificed just to make sure he could believe in magic, even just for a day. Her bills were finally paid on time. The collection calls had stopped. Her credit card, once a constant source of anxiety, was down to a zero balance. She even started to put away a small amount each month into a savings account. The first time in her life that savings wasn't just a word people on TV used. She started sleeping again, eating regularly, laughing without guilt. There were still moments when shame crept in, moments where she'd look in the mirror and wonder what parts of herself she had lost in all this. But there were moments too, stronger ones, moments where she felt proud, not of the situation, but of her endurance, her resilience, her ability to walk through hell and still hold her son's hands with steady fingers. She wasn't broken, she was surviving. And survival in a world like this was its own kind of defiance. She didn't talk about what she did, not to friends, not to coworkers. She knew the judgment would be swift, cruel, and unrelenting. People like to pretend they'd make better choices until they're backed into the same corner. But she also knew that if someone, anyone, truly saw her, the long hours, the cold dinners, the sacrifices stacked up like unpaid bills, they might understand, maybe even respect her. And the months rolled on. She began to plan, not just for the next week or the next month, but for the future, for her son's future. A better daycare, a part time online course she could take after she went to bed, an emergency fund, a dream she hadn't dared entertain since she was 18, owning a home. She didn't know how long this arrangement would last. Maybe one day it would end on her terms, maybe not. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had choices again. She had clawed her way out of drowning. She had made it. And in a world where the cost of living was rising faster than anyone could breathe, where systems failed the very people they claimed to protect, she had done the impossible. She kept her child safe, fed, housed, loved. And even if the world never knew her story, even if history forgot her name, she would remember. Because survival isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's quiet, ugly, unconventional, but always, always, it's worth it. Like and subscribe for more heart wrenching stories. Take care, everyone.